Show anymore. Okay. So Reverend Fathers, brothers and sisters in Christ, thank you for this opportunity. Yeah, it's really overwhelming. When Abuna first talked to me about this, I wasn't really sure. Public speaking is not my thing, but kind of like it behind the scenes. But I really got more unsure as I began to dive into this, because this is a mammoth undertaking to try and understand St. John Chrysostom. Let me grab my glasses just real quick. Just to give you an idea of how prolific he was. We have the commentaries and homilies from him on all the epistles of St. Paul, including Hebrews, which he believes was by Paul. 67 homilies in Genesis, 59 in the Psalms, 90 in the Gospel of St. Matthew, 88 from the Gospel of St. John, and 55 on the Acts of the Apostles. All in all, we have somewhere between 700 and 800 of his homilies recorded. I mean, if you just stopped right there with his homilies, it's an overwhelming amount of information to try and take in. But of course, then there's some, 240 some odd letters and treaties that we have left from him. It's an absolutely overwhelming amount of material. And, I was really quite overwhelmed, I keep saying it, but that's really the best word. Not to mention that over this past month or so, if any of you know, I work at the Washington State Department of Transportation. We've had all sorts of things going on, so I didn't have nearly enough time to prepare for this. Probably a whole lifetime wouldn't have been enough, but I'm very dissatisfied with these notes, so I'll probably kind of come in and out of them. The other thing that's really rough around here, there's a story about St. John. Well, it's not really a story, it's what somebody said that I listened to. But so when he was first elevated to the presbytery, he was immediately made the primary preacher in the first church of Antioch, the cathedral. And being the patriarchal seat, other bishops and well-known priests would come, and they'd have to come in there and preach in the same place that St. John Chrysostom preached. And it said that they were all quite reticent to do so. And, we got our two fathers here, great homilists. We've all been very blessed. And so, subdeacon who stays back there behind the scenes and unheard, it's tough to kind of step into this position. So it's really quite a lot for me. And so I'll beg your indulgences and the prayers of St. John Chrysostom and my patron and protector, St. Timothy. So that's really cool. Pardon me?
We love you.
Thank you. That's helpful. So I think you guys, just to give you some idea of some of the resources I used, Holy Fire, which you've seen with both of our fathers before. I really fell in love with the works of Dr. David Ford from St. Tikhon's. And I actually listened to a number of his talks, online and whatnot. But this book in particular, Women and Men in the Early Church, A Vision of St. John Chrysostom, mind-blowingly beautiful on his take. It's really quite fascinating in the sense that St. John, more than any other of the fathers of the church, wrote on marriage. And in contrast to what we see in something like Jerome or Augustine, he has a really, really high view of marriage and the beauty of it. And I mean, it's just mind-blowing as you go through this book, how he sees this ontological reality that happens between husband and wife. And it's really quite mind-blowing. So I definitely recommend this to anybody who wants to know anything about St. John. The other one is he translated the letters to St. Olympia. another beautiful, beautiful coverage of a number of letters that he wrote while he was in exile to a beloved spiritual daughter and helper. And they really, on two levels, they are really helpful. One is St. Olympia's battling some depression, and her heart's breaking because John's been taken from her. And so he's consoling her the whole time. But you also pick up his whole journey through his exile. And it was a rough journey, but he mentions it and he talks with her about it. I don't know how much of that I'll get to tonight because all these things are huge stories. But yeah, read this one. That's a great one. Got another one here from St. Anthony's Monastery. It's the homilies on the epistles to the Galatians. And then I read a number of homilies online that you can find and listen to countless podcasts and recorded content online. It was one of kind of just immerse myself when I was working on a spreadsheet or something where I didn't need to be fully present. So a couple comments about St. John, just so we can kind of put him into a context. So St. John was a fiery preacher, and he was trained in a form of rhetoric that used a lot of hyperbolic attack on the thing that he was opposing. And so he kind of gets this bad rap at sometimes. And two of the areas that I particularly noticed was on marriage and femininity in the females, and on the Jews. Famously, he gets criticized for his treatise on the Jews. But I think what we need to understand about that is he's not attacking, he's not an anti-Semite. He's not attacking the Jewish people. What he's trying to do is he's trying to address a number of his followers who have started to go back to the synagogues, started to go into the synagogues and participate in the services. And for St. John, this is it's like the children of Israel wanting to turn back and go back into Egypt, into slavery. So, he says at one point, he says, Christ has come, we put on Christ, we're elevated to this point. He says, and freed from the passions. And he says, the man who has been freed from the passion of anger doesn't need the law that thou shalt not kill. So why are you going back to this stuff? You're at a higher level. Why go back there? That's complete slavery. And as I mentioned, early on his views on marriage, early in his career, he writes his letters to St. Theodore, which I hope I'll get to talk about a little bit. And he writes another treatise to those who oppose the monastic life, and then on virginity and remarriage. And so if you just look at those pieces, it can seem like he's maybe looks down upon marriage as a lesser way towards salvation and sanctification. But then you turn around and read his homilies, and you start to get this beautiful stuff that I was talking about. You look at the way he treats even the beginning of these things in the book of Genesis, in the second chapter, when we're talking about the creation of Eve, he points out that nowhere is there mentioned anything about procreation. What was mentioned was that God made a helpmate, something that was suitable for man, and brought it out of him. And that's, you kind of start to get a sense of his understanding that contrary to, say, Augustine and some of the other teachers that you're going to see, especially in the West, that the union of man and woman is just some sort of condescension that happens after the fall in the garments of skin. There's elements of that. He's not unaware, and he's not going to not acknowledge certain parts of that. But his view of that union is so beautiful, and you can't take, if you take just the one or the other, you're going to get a mixed view of what St. John's all about. You have to take St. John in context, and that's kind of my point about him. When you're looking at St. John, context is everything. Let's see here. like I said, I'm not really happy with these, so we're going to kind of jump around a bit. I guess again, I would mention that he was trained as a rhetorician, and that there was a particular type of rhetoric that he was trained in and a master of. And it was this kind of bombastic attack. And then the elevation of the things that he was supporting. And so, again, as you read him, you have to have this context and understand that, like, he's not maybe as harsh as he sounds. He's actually quite a balanced and lovely pastoral teacher and father in Christ. And so I was really, really struck with that with him. In fact, I was super struck with just his balance. I mean, I'm skipping around and forgive me, but he's famous for talking about the middle road, the royal road, and where we avoid extremes out here and extremes out here. Again, you have to take it into context what he's talking about. He's talking about for those who are actually on the road of salvation in Christ, following the ways of the church, but not taking unto ourselves something that is too great or too little. The church gives us that safe middle road. And I think that that is one of the most beautiful things about John, is that he's just right there. He's so practical, if you really dive into him, about how we can actually live a victorious life in Christ and actually be something more than what we are. I was blown away. I think with that, we can kind of move on. Talk a little bit about his early life and his education. So he was born in Antioch in about 347. So Antioch, well, let me get to that later. But Antioch was an amazing city in that time. It was one of the three major cities of the empire: Constantinople, Alexandria, and Antioch. And it was probably one of the wealthiest cities in the empire at that time. It was kind of at the terminus of the Silk Road and the trading routes. And so you could get just about anything you wanted in Antioch as it moved through there. There were all the entertainments that you could possibly imagine, from the theater to the horses, to everything that was part of that world that was in Antioch. It was a chief city. It said that it was a beautiful city, that there were marble colonnades, golden statues, and streets paved with red granite everywhere. Antioch kind of sat in the middle of the Orontes River, on kind of like an island, and it was surrounded by these mountains that were pocked with caves where later St. John would go and live as a hermit for a while. But it was very protected because of this location, and so it thrived. In fact, I can't remember what the number was, but people talked about like the population density in there, and that people, as rich as it was, they would have been living in very, very small spaces because it was such a great place to be. There's some sort of saying like, it's better to be a dog and eat the scraps in Antioch than to live in the other parts of the empire, because that's how beautiful and well-heeled that city was. So this is kind of the context of John's youth, where he's growing up. Interestingly enough, when John was about 14, Julian the Apostate, the emperor at that time, forsakes Constantinople and moves his capital to Antioch, again, further elevating it. But there's kind of a cool story from then. Julian, wanting to inquire of the kind of the prophets of the pagans, the oracle there at the temple of Apollo, goes, and the oracle's like, hey, I can't do anything. I can't tell you anything. He says, you know why? It's because I'm blocked. Because just down the road here, there's this Saint Babylos who's relics are buried, and I just can't do anything because of it. So Julian, in his fine wisdom, decides that he's going to have those relics removed so that he can get his communication from Apollo. So he commissions them to dig up the relics and move them out. Well, the Christians are having none of it, so they get there before and they exhume St. Babylos, and they begin to process him outside of the city to a safe spot. John at 14 participates in this procession, and he's deeply touched by the worship and the movement of the saint. And interestingly enough, not long after that, a bolt of lightning comes out of nowhere, hits this temple of Apollo, and it bursts into flames. And it's not the last time we're going to hear about miraculous fire in St. John. I mean, so it becomes a thing in his life. But yeah, it really impressed John. He wasn't a baptized Christian at this point, which is probably the next place we go. Yeah. So his mother, Anthusa, we have the three mothers of the three holy hierarchs over there above Gregory, was a beautiful, pious Christian woman. It is difficult when you read these things because there's different accounts that get kind of confused and they have different facts, but if you boil them all down, Anthusa, I mean, she's a saint in our church, but she was a saint in her own time, from what we can know of her. She was quite young at the time of John's birth, and it seems likely that she had a daughter before him. Now, St. John's father, Secundus, was a high-ranking military officer from a wealthy Greek family of noble origin, and so the family was well off. They had a considerable estate and did well. But Secundus dies very shortly after John's birth. And St. Anthusa then, she was beautiful, it's said, and she has this considerable estate. She could have remarried. She would have been quite desirable, even for her political connections, if nothing else, based on the family's connections. But she puts all that aside, and she basically runs the family home like a little monastery. And they're very devout, very quiet, and this is where John grows up. Interestingly enough, she preserves the entirety of Secundus' estate for John when he ends up becoming of age, and leaves it untouched. So she wasn't only pious and virtuous, but she was a really good businesswoman. So, she did that pretty well. And it seems, that she avoided all of the social entanglements that a place like Antioch could have given with all the entertainments and the political elements of it. Part of having a considerable estate and good connections, she was able to give John the finest education in the empire at that time. So John was tutored or put into education in a classical education under the famous pagan rhetorician called Libanius. And interestingly enough, Libanius is so good at what he does. And really, for a pagan, he is a pagan, like straight out and out pagan. But for a pagan, a kind of moral guy in a sense. He has some sense of goodness and direction. But it's odd, he's actually said that he was friends and maybe part of what pulled Julian the Apostate out of the faith and into apostasy and back to the pagan religions. But Libanius was born to a similarly elevated family, and his dad dies not quite as young as John's, but when he's 11. And so I think that there's a certain affinity that he has for John, and he really, really loves John. And in fact, on his deathbed, the Christian historian Zosiman says that Libanius says, if the Christians hadn't taken him from us, John would be my successor. That's who he wanted. So this is sort of the preparation, the backbone that makes him this golden mouth preacher that we end up coming to know soon. So with the example of his pious mother, and then he forms an acquaintance and a friendship with the Archbishop Meletius, who was the Patriarch of Antioch at the time. And he has a friend, Basil, who was about the same age and really quite committed to the ascetic life already, and a friend, Maximus. Anyways, by all these influences, John, about 18 years of age, takes baptism. And that seems weird to us now, especially if we think Anthusa was a pious Christian. But in that time, that wasn't an unusual practice to be baptized late in life. The Emperor Constantine wasn't baptized until he was on his deathbed. A lot of things that go into that I don't quite understand, so I won't kind of venture into there. But it's something about defiling the beautiful garment of our enlightenment as we come out of the font. So, but after his baptism, John initially goes and takes after his education and decides to pursue a career in the law. And I better get my phone up here so Molly doesn't get mad and clap. But he's also takes to the Christian life with an incredible zeal. I mean, he really goes all in right from the beginning. And Palladius, one of the commentators, says that after his baptism, he neither swore nor defamed anyone, nor spoke falsely, nor cursed, nor even tolerated jokes. So I mean, he's all in. But his first inclination is to then go off and become a monk. For St. John, this seems the safest way to pursue your salvation, away from all the allures of the city, the traps that we can fall into, and just a life dedicated to that. And if we consider that he grew up in an environment not unlike a monastery with his mother, it kind of makes some sense. But his mom is not having it. And not for any other reason than she feels like she needs him. And so, I can read this, I'll try. St. John relates this scene himself in one of his writings, and he says, she took him to her chamber, and by the bed where she gave him birth, she adjured him with tears not to forsake her. My son, she said, my only comfort in the midst of the miseries of this earthly life is to see thee constantly, and behold in thy features the faithful image of my beloved husband, who is no more. This comfort commenced with your infancy, before you could speak. I ask only one favor of you. Do not make me a widow a second time. Wait till I die. Perhaps that shall be soon, and I'll leave this world. And when you have buried me and joined my ashes to those of your father, nothing will prevent you from going into the monastic life. But as long as I breathe, support me by your presence, and do not draw down upon you the wrath of God by bringing such evils upon me. Pretty persuasive. And so, yeah, so John yields. But he then takes and makes his home a small monastery. And he starts to be joined by Maximus and some of his friends. And Theodore, who we'll talk about here in just a moment. So both become bishops of the church themselves. Saint Theodore Mopsuestia, I think is how you say it, is a saint of the church as well. Yeah, says so anyway. That's what the words say. But one of the second things I was struck with is how important good company, good examples, and good fellowship is. They support each other. And in fact, that kind of gets into the whole idea of the whole discussion of St. Theodore. So after St. Anthusa's death, they do go to join into the monastic life. And some period during there, St. Theodore, just in case, ends up falling in love with this beautiful lady named Hermione. And St. John sets to writing 2 different letters to pull him back into his monastic vows and to save him from violating those vows. And to kind of give you some idea of how over the top he could be, he says in one of the passages that the groundwork of this corporeal beauty is, talking about Hermione, is nothing else but phlegm and blood and humor and bile and fluids of masticated food. For by these things both eyes and cheeks and all the other features are supplied with moisture. If they do not receive that moisture daily, skin becomes unduly withered, and the eyes sunken, and the whole grace of the countenance immediately vanishes. So if you consider what is stored up inside those beautiful eyes, and that straight nose, and that mouth and cheeks, you will affirm the well-shaped body to be nothing else but a whited sepulchre, the parts within which are so much uncleanness. And he goes on to talk about how if you saw that phlegm and stuff on a rag, you wouldn't even touch it with the tips of your fingers. So, anyways, the appeal has its desired effect. Theodore resumes his monastic life and afterwards becomes the bishop of Mopsuestia in Sicilia and one of the biblical scholars of the Antiochian school of hermeneutics, which really becomes, is worthy of mention. St. John and he become 2 of the shining lights of this school. And in contrast to, say, something like the School of Alexandria was very allegorical, this is very straightforward. The former Protestants of us, among us, would be very, very comfortable with this school of verse by verse, chapter by chapter, just exegetical approach. And then that's kind of this school that comes out in Antioch, in which John is the main light and luminary of. So as I mentioned, John's in the monastic life, and after a number of years there with St. Basil and them, or not St. Basil, but Basil, I think he becomes a saint, but Basil of Antioch. He goes and takes up an hermetic life. So he goes to live in a cave by the blessing of his spiritual father, and really gets extreme in his asceticism. And it says that he eats very, very little. He stands all night in prayer and memorizes pretty much the whole New Testament, most of the Psalms, and big chunks of the Old Testament. And in this extreme effort, basically injures himself. He messes up his body, and he becomes sick for the rest of his life with stomach and kidney disorders. So, as a result of this, he has to return to Antioch. He has to come down out of the mountains and go into the city. And almost immediately, Archbishop Meletius grabs him and ordains him as a deacon. So during this period, it appears during this period. So I'm making some jumps here because this next thing I'm going to talk about is it goes into St. John, another one of St. John's great treatise on the priesthood, which is probably the thing on the priesthood for Orthodox Christians anyways. But it's not entirely clear, at least to me in my reading, of whether this was while he was a deacon and going to be made a presbyter, or if they were going to grab them for the episcopacy. But nonetheless, the story is still the same. So somewhere during this period, John and his friend Basil were chosen for ordination in Antioch, and they make a pact. Both feared the responsibility of priesthood and agreed that if one was ordained, the other one would be as well. But John sneaks off and hides, and he doesn't get ordained, and Basil is taken and ordained. And you can imagine this kind of creates a little rift in their relationship. Basil feels quite tricked. So later on, John writes on the priesthood, and basically he writes this extensive treatise on the priesthood, talking about how incredibly holy and set apart the priesthood is, and why he himself was not quite ready, but Basil was. And so he's kind of justifies this. I got to admit, I didn't read the whole thing. I've read bits and parts of it. I don't really know how the story ends, but they end up apparently becoming friends. But it's during that period that he writes this. And so some of these writings are happening as he's a deacon. He won't preach yet. Apparently, deacons probably weren't allowed to preach at that time, but he was writing, and especially these early letters. So somewhere in about 386, after the passing of Bishop Melitius, again, another controversy. There's 2 bishops in Antioch at this time, but from what I can tell, it's Archbishop Flavian that now pulls him and elevates him to the priesthood. And as I said, immediately he is made the primary preacher in the great church there in Antioch. And he spends 12 years in this position. And he gains incredible popularity. His eloquence and insightful preaching of the scriptures and moral teaching are just eaten up by the crowds. He basically celebrates the liturgy every single day. And people set aside their work and come to hear him preach. Even if they can't stay for the whole liturgy, they come to hear him preach from all over Antioch. So in his teaching, he even from this early period, is very concerned with charitable giving and the spiritual and temporal needs of the poor. Another one of the examples I took is he's in one of his homilies says, "Do you wish to honor the body of Christ? Do not ignore him when you see him naked. Do not pay him homage in the temple clad in silk, only then to neglect him outside where he is cold and ill-clad. He who said, 'This is my body,' is the same who said, 'You saw me hungry and you gave me no food.' And whenever you did to the least of my brothers, you did also to me. What good is it if the Eucharist table is overloaded with golden chalices when your brother is dying of hunger? Start by satisfying his hunger, and then with what is left, you may adorn the altar as well." Again, you can see he has a very expansive style. Like he's coming after it. He doesn't hold back. He's not going like, "Well, we should feed the poor." I mean, he's serious about it. Anyways, his fame grows and grows and grows, and now he's known all over the empire. And in about 397, Nectarius, the archbishop, the patriarch in Constantinople, dies. And this kind of sets out a whole bunch of stuff. I don't know. I'm going to have to hurry, so I'll cut a lot of it out. But essentially, because there's so much intrigue in Constantinople, if you start to read this story, you realize, we think our day's filthy. Oh my goodness, the stuff in court and the politics of the day were just horrible back then as well. But there's a eunuch who somehow rises to power. He named Eutropius. He was said to be a gift to the Empress Eudoxia at the time of her marriage, and through some little jobs in court, ends up with intrigues and blackmail, rising way up to become consul of the realm. And he kind of favors John, and he talks to Emperor Arcadius, and they decide, yeah, John's going to be the man. But they know that the people of Antioch are going to riot. Like, they're not letting John go. No way. And they know John will run from it too. But they say, no, he's got to be patriarch. So Eutropius kind of manipulates Flavian. He says, send John to this little chapel out here in the country, and we just need to have a meeting with him. So St. John walks out to the country, and as soon as he gets there, he's taken into custody by the imperial guard and immediately taken to Constantinople. I mean, like, he can't go back and get his clothing. He doesn't get to say goodbye to his friends, nothing. He's gone. And he ends up in Constantinople. But this kind of sets the stage. Now they have to get him made an archbishop. Well, the Archbishop Theophilus of Alexandria is there, and Eutropius has a little bit of dirt on him, and he doesn't want to lay hands on John and make him a bishop because he's jealous of him. It's just straight up jealous. But they finagle him to do it. John's made archbishop, and for a time things go well. Trying to skip a lot of things here. John becomes consecrated. So the Empress Eudoxia at first is a beautiful spiritual child of St. John, and she spends nights in vigil with him. He extols her great virtue when, on an occasion of a translation of a saint's relics outside of the city to a chapel, she follows barefoot without her royal regalia, and she just walks with the people. And John gets there, and one of the recorded homilies, he said, "Oh, what virtue! The moon isn't even as wonderful as our empress." And he goes on and on and on and singing her praises, which become kind of interesting because their relationship takes some strange turns. But John's first years in that regard are pretty good. But he sets out right away. His predecessor, Nectarius, was known for giving great and luxurious banquets. Many of the clergy were corrupt and lazy. And John's having none of it. He's having none of it. He comes in and he starts to set the law right away. And he ends up disciplining a number of the clergy. And on top of that, he starts preaching just like he did in Antioch. And he goes he preaches against the excessive use of wealth that he sees all around him. And one of the stories of that, so John's preaching, and he talks, I don't know how to do this slightly. So apparently a number of the wealthy had silver chamber pots. And John's like, what? Silver chamber pots? And so he's, in one of his homilies, he says, is it not possible for one to be wealthy and just at the same time? Do you pay such honor to your excrements as to receive them in a silver chamber pot? When another man made in the image of God is perishing in the cold? So he's not making a lot of friends among that wealth class out there. Then John goes and starts selling off the marble and many of the valuables within the church and uses them to feed the poor, to create a home for the widows, and one of the first hospitals. So he's all about real Christian service to people, and he doesn't really care who opposes him. He's going to do what he's going to do. But as I said, eventually things take a turn, and at some point John writes a treatise or a homily saying that nothing can harm those who don't harm themselves. And it's really about the patient endurance of trials and how he's famed for saying glory to God for all things. And he's really going to get a chance to live this out, and God will use it to purify him. But so we mentioned the Empress Eudoxia and how initially she's quite devout and loving with John. He baptizes her son. They're very close indeed. And it appears that she had the inner strength that she could have been a saint had she wanted to, but instead she turns it to a quest for power and destruction of her enemies, which eventually ends to the destruction of John. Part of this starts when Eudoxia realizes that Arcadius, the emperor, her husband, is really a weak-willed man, and he's basically run by the eunuch Eutropius and other members of the court. And she's a princess of the Goths. She's quite from a hardy stock, and she's willing and wanting to take power. She actually wants to be crowned Augusta, basically the female ruler, and eventually kind of does. Skip this. There's a story about how Eutropius, this eunuch, starts to fall out as well with Empress Eudoxia. I'll just say that, eventually he tells her, he says, "I raised you to power, I can easily break you." And she's, again, not having that. So she goes after him, which starts a whole other thing for St. John. So about this time, Emperor Theophilus over in Alexandria has this problem with these 4 monastic brothers called the Tall Brothers, the 4 Tall Brothers. And they apparently have some Orgianistic tendencies, and even though Theophilus in his beginning had some himself, he's ready to persecute them. One of the things you got to remember is that Origen's not formally condemned for another 100-some years. So even though there's already problems in the church with some of his teachings, and they're examining them and arguing about them, it's not a formal condemnation. But for whatever reason, Theophilus really gets into it with the 4 brothers, and he cuts them out of communion. He throws them. They have to leave the territory. They're driving around. So eventually they end up in Constantinople to appeal to Emperor Arcadius and to St. John for help. They want to be restored to communion. Theophilus already doesn't like St. John very well. He was already jealous of him. Now he's patriarch in Constantinople, now the chief city of the whole empire. And St. John receives the 4 brothers. Now he doesn't commune them. He's careful, but he receives them. He gives them a place to stay. He gives them some protection. And Theophilus is demon. Somewhere around the same time, that eunuch decides he's going to use the dirt he had on Theophilus from the beginning, and Theophilus is condemned before Arcadius and called to Constantinople to stand trial. He's wily, so he delays. And while he's delaying, he buys all sorts of gifts. So in the meantime, back in Constantinople, John's preaching, and he's going after his clerics, but he uses the phrase, where is it? basically, he calls Empress Eudoxia Jezebel. I mean, she is starting to really go for the power. And he's really referring to his clerics who, he says, are you, go eat at the table of Jezebel? And I'm trying to remember how he says it. He says, yeah, if Jezebel's table be the table of the Lord, eat at it. Eat at it until you vomit. So, he's battling that. So now, Eudoxia, the very powerful empress, is got her nose bent out of shape over this. And, John's a little like, hey, Cinderella, if the shoe fits, wear it, He says, I really wasn't directly coming after you, but if you're taking offense, there might be something in it. And she's quite angry. Theophilus has got these gifts. He finally arrives in Constantinople, and he stays just outside. He won't join St. John in the patriarchal residence. And he starts to buy favor with all the leading people, including the Empress Eudoxia. So rather than Theophilus standing trial, all of a sudden now he gathers a bunch of his Alexandrian bishops around him, and they go out to the Oak, and they have this Synod of the Oak, and they condemn John now for treason, for calling her Jezebel, and for a number of other things. And this occasions John's first exile. So, again, in the interest of time, John's exiled. They send him just across the Bosphorus. He's over there. And that night, Eudoxia is in her chamber, and it says that the world shook. Some say it was a great earthquake. Some say that Eudoxia had a miscarriage. Whatever it was significant, because she goes, oh man, I messed with the man of God. We got to get him back here. Boom, St. John comes back. It lasts about a year, because John's not changing. He's still preaching. He's still going to go. And some point after this, there is raised just across the courtyard from the Hagia Sophia, not the current one we know today, but the one built by Constantine originally. Across there is a great silver statue of Eudoxia's elevated, and John's not having it. So he starts preaching again, and he goes, again Herodias raves, again she dances, and again she desires to receive John's head on the charger. And it's done. So again, they phony up another bunch of charges in the synod, and they depose John. John doesn't leave immediately, but when he does, an interesting thing happens. A fire starts in the altar of the Hagia Sophia, and it raises up rather quickly, and it almost acts like it's alive, and they say it twists and turns like a snake. But it comes up, and it comes out of the church, and it goes over the courtyard, and bends back down and forms a big arch and sets on fire part of the palace. Again, miraculous fire plays a part in St. John's life. They accuse John of this now as well. So he's deposed. Where are we time-wise? I need to get done, don't I? Okay, so we'll just do that. John goes into exile. I would encourage you to read the letters to St. Olympia. You'll learn a lot about those. But he travels down to the southern kind of part of Turkey, and he's there for a while. But that's not good enough. The anger just continues to rage. And John doesn't stop being patriarch, even though he's been deposed. He's writing letters, and he's moving the faithful clergy around, and he's correcting the ills of the church, simony, and other things that are going on. They're not having it, so then they sentence him to go all the way up the east coast of the Black Sea, up into an area of occupied Georgia today called Abkhazia, into a city up there. On the way, they stop at a little chapel outside of the town of Komana, and it's a basilica, or St. Basilicus's little martyrarium, or whatever you want to call it. So they spend the night there. The saint visits St. John in the night and basically says, tomorrow you're going to be with me. John's like, cool. Amen. He wants to celebrate the liturgy, but they won't have it. So the soldiers try and move him. Weather, and apparently St. John's illness caused them to turn back. They come back. St. John asks for fresh white vestments. He basically lays down and says, glory to God for all things, and reposes. A number of years later, the son of Eudoxia is now emperor, and
is that the one who baptized?
I don't know. I assume so, but so it's Theodosius II. He calls for St. John's relics to be brought from there back to Constantinople and put in the Church of the Holy Apostles. It's said that as St. John comes back, that the people are all out there in their boats with candles and lights, and it looked like the whole Bosphorus was just a sea of light. And as they bring him into the city, he has to go by Eudoxia's tomb. And it said that John sits up and says, "Be at peace, Eudoxia." Now, the part of that I didn't explain is that it said that Eudoxia was riddled with worms and died in a great agony, and that her tomb shook from the day of her interment until that day. And the tomb stops to shake as John goes by and says, "Be at peace." So that's an interesting one. I should probably end. I'll just say that St. John, for me, and from what I can tell, is probably most notable for his his line by line exegetical approach to preaching and a serious approach to biblical Christianity. He fought the heretics just like most of the other saints. He opposed the Arians, the Manichaeans, Paul Samsotas, or whatever, how you say that. I'm terrible with those words. But for me, and I think for most people, his enduring legacy is in his beautiful exposition of the scriptures according to a true early patristic Orthodox understanding. And that's where I think the great value for all of us is. Obviously, we know that we celebrate his Divine Liturgy most Sundays, Paschal Homily that we hear every year, the St. John's. The shadow he casts over the church is immense, and we're greatly blessed to have him as one of our patrons and protectors. So I don't know what else I could say. I mean, I could say a lot, but man, I'm sweating and shaking, and I think that's about the best I can pull off. I would answer any question if there was any. Michelle?
So I know that Saints Basil and Gregory were friends.
Yeah.
Did they know St. John? I know he was a little bit later than that, but why in particular? I know about the people that were fighting in the 11th century, but was there something that they were all together at that kind of group then?
It doesn't appear so, but St. John definitely knows, especially of St. Basil's work, because he uses a lot of it in his expository work.
How far in time are they apart? Because aren't they all from the same?
Yeah, they're pretty close. I think John would have been, quite young when Basil died, but I mean, probably a teen or something, early teens. I don't honestly know the dates exactly. John was born in 347. I'm not sure when St. Basil died.
I read that he may have met St. Gregory the Village later. This would be way after St. Basil died.
That would make some sense.
But they didn't run together. And they weren't, it wasn't like Basil and Gregory. They didn't have a relationship.
Right.
But that was wonderful, and I think we have another Chrysostom.
No. Chuck, did you have something? I'm sorry.
This may not even be on topic, but I'm always struck by when these great heroes of the early church are exiled. And how did it work? Did it just was it like the Wild West and say, get out of town by sundown? Or was it that he was escorted somewhere?
He was
and
escorted.
Then he was watched the whole time? Said,
Yeah, he had a retinue of imperial soldiers that were driving him on at each point. And I said, I wish I had 100 years to talk about it, because there's so much. If you get into his exile and you read about how, they're going through these horrible wastelands and stuff, and in bitter cold and great heat, and then there's robbers and stuff that are chasing him all the time, and then he gets to places, and Theophilus, not content with getting him kicked out, actually riles up monks, and they come after him with clubs and stuff. So there's all sorts of crazy stuff that goes on in his life, but yeah, it's huge. It's such a mountain of information and stories and things that, yeah, it would be really, really hard to deal with in a short period of time. Anything else?
Was it him with the earthquake where he had them right on their houses? What was it like?
I don't know about that, but there was an earthquake early when he's first made a presbyter that might have played into that. There's also another, yeah, I'll stop. But I don't know about that. Sorry.